Today's lesson on the rise of imperialism looks at the tail end of the 19th century. In order to look at that more concretely and to really understand why the Age of Imperialism arose, we're going to look at Europe after the Napoleonic era. Look at Europe in the middle of the century. Look at what European states were doing in the middle of the century so that we can see this clear progression that leads to the rise of imperialism about the year 1870. What we see here is a map of the land considerations at the Congress of Vienna, which takes place between the years 1814 and 1815. As you read, the Congress of Vienna was the attempt of European powers to fix everything that Napoleon had done over the course of his imperial reign. Napoleon's empire building had really seriously changed Europe's borders between 1800 and 1814. For example, the Holy Roman Empire had completely disappeared. It was replaced by a confederation of German states. Lots of monarchies had been taken over, and they were headed by different brothers of Napoleon. The Netherlands, Spain, Italy, all of these were now headed by Napoleon's brothers. France itself had expanded at the expense of the Italian republics, at the expense of Austria-Hungary, and at the expense of other German states. So all of these issues were issues that needed to be addressed at the Congress of Vienna. Now, the first order of business was to restore the very traditional, mostly absolutist monarchies in Europe with the original ruling families. So Napoleon's family's out, all of the original families are in. For example, in France, you have the rise of Louis XVIII. Louis XVIII was a younger brother of Louis XVI. If you guys will remember, Louis's son and heir died in prison during the Reign of Terror, so he obviously wasn't able to take control of France. In Spain, Ferdinand VII from the Habsburg dynasty comes back into power after Napoleon's brother is evicted. And in the Netherlands, William I of the House of Orange comes back into power. So the original families all come back in these different countries. This conservative restoration was really important because really what they were trying to do at the Congress of Vienna is to say, hey, we are coming back. We're going back to what we're used to. It's going to be as though what Napoleon did never even existed. And in fact, in a lot of ways, it's going to be as though the Enlightenment, at least the political part of the Enlightenment, had never happened. So the second order of business that they really had to deal with was war reparations, trading land and money around so that all of the victors felt like they got back what they had lost during the Napoleonic era. Now, France, as a result of these reparations, basically lost all of the land that they had annexed under Napoleon and even earlier during the French Revolution. They lost some of their colonies, they lost some of their island territories that they had held. Most of these all went to Great Britain. The Holy Roman Empire was not reformed at the Congress of Vienna. Instead, the Confederation of German States essentially remained in place, but the northern states, all these areas right here, they get influenced by Prussia. And the southern states, these areas right here, they get influenced by Austria-Hungary. The Netherlands ceded its big colony, Cape Colony in South Africa, for the ability to annex the Austrian Netherlands, or what we today call Belgium. And in this way, the Netherlands expanded their territory to pretty much be that entire coastline of the North Sea. The big winner in all of this land exchange was Great Britain, who didn't gain any additional lands in Europe, but that didn't matter. They got all sorts of colonial territories. They added islands in the Caribbean and in Asia. They added Cape Colony in South Africa. So they just had an explosion of their colonial empire of great benefit to them. So the Congress of Vienna restored the traditional monarchies and then moved land around so that it appeared more like it had been before Napoleon. The third order of business for the Congress of Vienna was to try to ensure that another Napoleon could not arise in Europe. What they wanted to do was create an alliance system that would ensure the diplomatic discussion of problems instead of using war as diplomacy, which is something that, of course, a French king, Louis XIV, had really pioneered. Well, some of these countries wanted a Christian-based alliance. These are the countries that formed the Holy Alliance. They are Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Prussia. However, other countries wanted a less religiously based and more diplomatic format for the discussion of problems. And eventually, you get the creation of the Concert of Europe, which included the Holy Alliance countries of Austria, Hungary, Prussia, and Russia, but also included Great Britain and then, in fact, France. These countries together were known as the Great Powers of Europe, which leads to this question, right? Did the Concert of Europe help? Which I love this cartoon, kind of making fun of this Concert of Europe. Well, it did help a little bit. The 19th century is often referred to as the peaceful century or the long 19th century because, in comparison to the almost constant warfare of previous centuries, it really was peaceful. However, that does not mean that there weren't insurrections, battles, or even wars during the 19th century because, of course, that did happen. What it means, though, is that you have a lot more peace instead of constant war. And that, I think, is definitely due to this importance of the balance of power between the great powers of Europe. There were several blips in this planned balance of power, and once the middle of the century hit, we really see these serious problems emerge, both socially and politically, in Europe. By 1848, the reality of the Industrial Revolution, which was now active in most European countries as well as in the Americas, had caused very serious upheaval among the social classes of cities, right, in urban areas. As the working environments in factories got worse, workers were much more liable to revolt against the factory owners. Well, that was going on, but at the same time, you had people kind of looking back at the Enlightenment and saying, hey, wait a minute. I thought we were supposed to get equal rights. I thought we were supposed to get civil rights. Where are they? They never, ever materialized. So you also get revolts against the upper classes because people, whether they're factory workers or not, just want greater rights. As a result of this, you have just kind of a spread of revolts across Europe. As you can see on the map, the great majority of those revolts are basically occurring kind of in the middle of Europe. In Central Europe, though, these revolts are largely unsuccessful, partly because traditional monarchies, which were more absolutist than not, remained in power. The monarchies often promised some sort of constitutional reform, but nothing ever materialized. These social tensions, these ethnic tensions with nationalism, really also only occur in Central Europe and in France because these are the areas that are now most recently experiencing industrial change. In other places, like in Spain or Portugal, you don't really have industrialization yet. And so these areas aren't going to be prone to these big revolutions quite at all. And when you look at a country like the Austrian Empire, which is right here, you're looking at lots of different ethnicities. These ethnicities are also fighting for greater rights in their territory. So in the Austrian Empire, where you have Austrians, but also Hungarians, Transylvanians, even some Poles, they all want a greater say in their government. And that's not really something that the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, Franz Joseph, is very much willing to give them. In all of these border areas, too, look at this huge border between Austria-Hungary and Russia, this pretty huge border between the Ottoman Empire and Austria. These areas are also pretty ripe for fighting and for ethnic nationalism. You have this whole territory in what is modern-day Moldova, which is a province for the Ottoman Empire, but this whole territory right here is claimed by Russia. They want to be a part of Russia, but the Ottoman Empire is trying to claim them. And so you have tension between the great powers as well. In France specifically, the revolutions of 1848 lead to the creation of the Second French Republic, so the end of the monarchy, beginning of the Second French Republic in late 1848. The man who's elected as the first president of this Second French Republic is a man by the name of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. Within 4 years, this man has started to revitalize France such that he holds an election in 1852, and it's a very simple election, more for referendum really. He wants to name himself the Emperor of France, and the French people, nostalgic now for the great nationalism and pride of France under Napoleon I, say yes. So Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, President Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, becomes Napoleon III, the Emperor of the Second French Empire. Now, once he became emperor, Napoleon III kept pushing himself into other countries' business, much like his uncle had done, actually. And like his uncle, he viewed Russia as a particular threat to France and to French expansion, so he kept a really close eye on any movements that the Russian army was making. To be fair, Russia was trying to expand its territory, mostly at the expense of the northern and eastern edge of the Ottoman Empire. So stop and ask, why would Russia want to expand? If you said Russia probably wants more coastline, because you're thinking back to Peter the Great, you're right. That was a big reason for Russian expansion. The problem was that Russia couldn't get more coastline unless it hit at the Ottoman Empire. Since the other great powers of Europe saw the Ottoman Empire as an important and necessary buffer between expansionist tendencies of the Russians and even of the Austrians, Napoleon III urged Britain to help France intervene and keep Russia on its side of the Black Sea. This disagreement, let's say, between the great powers leads to the outbreak of the Crimean War, which is fought between 1854 and 1856. So yes, it's a peaceful century, but it is not without its wars. Long story short, Russia loses the war after a couple of really spectacular losses. However, clearly Russia's not over that, right? As recent events would indicate, Russia still wants the Crimean and has in fact annexed it officially as of last week. So we'll see what ends up happening with that here in the future. However, Russia's loss to Britain and France wasn't the important legacy of the Crimean War. Then again, maybe it was, right? As modern history entails. The most important legacies, though, of the Crimean War were as follows. Let's consider that the Crimean War is considered the first modern war in that it includes a lot of the innovations of the Industrial Revolution. For example, we're going to have for the first time the use of the steamboat, which is transporting both French and British soldiers and supplies to the Crimea, right? It's coming from the Mediterranean, up here through the Aegean Sea, and then into the Black Sea, right, into the Crimean area. So that's hugely important, steam power to bring army supplies to the Crimean. The Western armies also used a brand new type of rifle. It was a butt-loading or breech-loading rifle called the Enfield rifle. These rifles were safer, they were much more efficient than front-loading rifles, so that was a good, beneficial change. Finally, the telegraph allows armies and journalists to report back to the home front really quickly. So not only did you have journalists covering the war, but they were able to send back stories pretty much immediately. Who won which battle? How many losses were there? How many projected losses were there? And more than that, the Crimean War is also the first one documented in photographs. Although it's not war photography in the way that we think of it today, the photographs that they took during the Crimean War didn't include anything as grotesque as dead bodies or actual fighting. Mostly because newspapers and journalists thought that that was really bad for Victorian sensibilities. However, they would take landscape photos before and after battles, for example, so you could see how the geography had changed. They took a lot of images of military camps and field hospitals. And on that note, Florence Nightingale really pioneers the concept of the field hospital during the Crimean War. This was a woman living in Victorian England who reads about these soldiers who are dying because they don't have access to quick medical care. And so she goes to the Crimean and she just is trying to make herself useful. And in doing so, really brings about the concept of the modern field hospital where you evacuate the wounded as quickly as you can from the battlefield and you try to treat their more serious wounds as quickly as possible in the hopes not just of saving their lives, but of saving their limbs, etc. And because she did this, she basically begins a new career path for a lot of women because now they can become nurses. That was seen as an okay career path for women. So the Crimean War was Napoleon III's first little opening salvo. The second one has to do with Mexico. In 1821, as you guys all know now, Mexico had won its independence from Spain. However, since the 1820s, Mexico had fallen further and further behind in a variety of debts as they were trying to create this brand new country. They owed money to Britain, they owed money to France, and yes, they even owed money to Spain. Well, after the Crimean War, Britain and France were trying to fatten up their treasuries, and they convinced Spain, hey, let's go to Mexico. Let's tell them that they need to pay us back for our debts. And so they threaten military action against Mexico if the debts go unpaid. The response from Mexico was very quick, but completely unwanted. The president at the time, Benito Juarez, who is in fact the first mestizo president of Mexico, he tells the Europeans, he's like, Mexico can't pay down the debt. We have way too much to do to try to stabilize ourselves. So in fact, we're going to not pay the debts for a few years. We're going to settle ourselves down, and then we're going to begin repayments again. Well, Britain and France and Spain were very unhappy with the situation, so they sent people to go and figure out diplomatically how they might address the situation. And eventually treaties were signed, and both Britain and Spain agreed that they were going to wait for the repayment to begin. Napoleon, however, decided he was not going to wait, and he continued with a planned invasion of Mexico in retaliation for the non-repayment of the debt. What Napoleon was hoping was that he'd be able to gain a colony that was already well organized and that was already industrious, and that France would benefit from this gain enormously. So really stop and think about what Napoleon III is thinking. This is a country that has been a sovereign, independent country for 40 years, and Napoleon intends to go and take it over and make it a colony now of the French Empire. The opening battle of this little intervention was a success for the Mexicans. On the 5th of May of 1862, a ragtag army at Puebla, led by General Zaragoza, who incidentally was a Texan-born Mexican, successfully repelled the invading French army, and they forced the retreat of the French army. So this was a huge success. This was great for morale. Unfortunately for the Mexicans, though, the French responded by sending reinforcements. This would lead to the defeat of the Mexican army and the occupation of Mexico by France. And so basically for the next decade, Mexico will be occupied by a French army. At that point, a coalition of very conservative Mexicans conspired to force Benito Juarez into exile, hoping to set up Mexico as a monarchy, which is what they had wanted initially. They didn't want it to be a republic. So Benito Juarez goes into exile in Louisiana, as it turns out. And in the meantime, these conservatives establish a monarchy, which they call the Second Empire of Mexico. This is the flag of the Second Empire. The new Mexican emperor was an Austrian noble, Maximilian, who was the younger son of the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. So while Mexico was supposedly this independent monarchy, it really operated as a new French colony. This greatly shifted the balance of power in Europe, and it made a lot of European countries feel not very neighborly toward the French. But the situation was going to be short-lived. In 1865, the Mexican army began defeating the French army again, repeatedly, and in 1866, when the United States threatened intervention in Mexico, Napoleon III ordered the removal of the remaining French troops. This left Maximilian alone completely, with just a fighting force made up of these conservative Mexicans who had wanted to keep him as their king. By 1867, the Mexican Republican Army had succeeded in taking back the country, and they capture and arrest Maximilian, who is pictured here. Maximilian is executed in June of 1867 by the Mexican government. It's a really sad story, actually, and as the story goes, Maximilian had learned to love Mexican culture, and so when he was asked his final wishes before his execution, he asked for just two things. The first was that he not be shot in the head so that his mother might be able to recognize him when his body was shipped back to Europe. Secondly, he asked that a mariachi play at his execution so that he could hear the music that he loved so much. It's kind of a really sad story in the end. So let's stop and think about this a little bit. The United States doesn't get involved until 1866, and yet that's weird, because here is this fight for a colony happening just south of the United States. So why would the U.S. wait so late in the game to get involved? If you remember that the United States was involved in a little war called the Civil War in the early 1860s, and that's your answer. From 1860 basically until 1865, the United States really wasn't in any place to attempt to help the Mexican army, and so they couldn't. And it wasn't until after the Civil War had concluded that the United States jumped back in and issued its warning to France. So unfortunately for Napoleon, while he was busy with his Mexican interlude, there were changes happening in Europe that are going to greatly affect the future of the Second French Empire. Beginning in the middle of the 19th century, Italian nationalists had moved to achieve the unification of Italy. In Italy, the organizer of the unification movement was Count Camillo Benso di Cavour, who was a noble. His ally, though, was a commoner, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Garibaldi had fought in the revolutions of South America, and so he comes to the unification effort of Italy with a lot of knowledge, a real inherent ability to get people to fight for what they want. So he helped organize the Italian people into mobile armies. By 1870, the Italian army had captured the last holdout in unification, which was the city of Rome, whose leader, the Pope, was fighting against unification because the Pope feared that a unified Italy would put a political organization above the authority of the Pope. However, a year later, Italy's unification was official. Italy became a constitutional monarchy under a North Italian noble who took the title Vittorio Emanuele I. Germany was unifying at the very same time. In 1858, Wilhelm I ascended the Prussian throne after his brother stepped down. He was autocratic and he wasn't really well liked by the Prussian Diet or Parliament, so he was unable to get a lot of what he wanted done. But then he allied with a really brilliant politician by the name of Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was an aristocrat. He was a traditionalist. He wanted to maintain the king's superior position. It was Bismarck who was going to mastermind the German unification. Between 1866 and 1870, Prussia and other German states from the Confederation of German States would come together to fight a series of wars against outsiders. Each war brings the German states closer, and that's a step closer to creating this unified Germany. So you start out with Prussia, which is just what you guys see here in the dark blue. And then in a war against Denmark, they get Hanover. A war against Austria, they're getting these areas in the lighter blue. And then comes the final war, the war between Prussia and France, which had the added benefit of forcing Napoleon III's abdication when Prussia won. It allowed the Prussians to now annex these areas that you guys see here kind of in purple, and it allows a now unified Germany to crown their first Kaiser, Wilhelm, at Versailles. Napoleon III was forced to flee France, and the Second French Empire ended. As a result, France became a republic again. All of that I just did leads us kind of finally to the rise of imperialism. Beginning about 1870, so coinciding with the end of Italian and German unification, European powers are going to begin a new concerted effort to expand their territories abroad, primarily through the acquisition of colonies. So why? Well, there are lots of reasons. The first one really is industrialization. As you've read, industrialization occurred in two waves. You have the textile and the steam engine first wave, and then you have that second wave starting about the 1840s, communication and transportation, and it begins in Great Britain. Britain had various conditions which allowed for the adoption of industrialization and its spread. When industrialization started in the middle of the 1700s, Britain already had a stable political system. They had a stable empire. They had already adopted, really, capitalism for all intents and purposes. The introduction of industrialization across continental Europe and the Americas doesn't occur until the beginning of the 19th century, when more stable political systems emerge in those areas. However, these countries are going to quickly realize that they needed colonial empires in order to best exploit the industrial economy. The countries which already had colonial empires, like France, could jump right into the Industrial Revolution. They were getting raw resources from other places. But the countries who didn't have a colonial empire, countries like Spain or Italy or Germany or even Russia, they're really going to struggle to compete effectively and to industrialize as quickly as Britain or France do. However, after 1871, when both Italy and Germany achieve unification, those countries can focus on the accumulation of empire, and so a new age of expansion, which we call the Age of Imperialism, can begin. A second reason is nationalism. Nationalism is the extreme pride in one's country, and this emerges as a really important philosophy of the middle and late 19th century in Europe. Nationalism leads to the reemergence of rivalries between the great powers. So the concert of Europe starts to fracture a little bit by the time we get to the 1870s. How do you prove that you're better than your rival? Well, getting more colonies is certainly one way to do that. So this competitive nature shows itself in the Age of Imperialism. And finally, the rise of this concept of social Darwinism. So let's stop here and look at this cartoon that you guys see. What do you see? Now, what might it mean? Hopefully, you guys see the image of a man, and he's a white man. In this case, he's actually identified as an American. And he's holding, like you would maybe carry a baby, a stereotypical image of a native person. And based on the stereotype here, I would say maybe an African person. And he's carrying him kind of literally up a hill to a schoolhouse. And there's a very happy American flag up at the top. And then you have the title of the cartoon, right? The White Man's Burden. European nationalism also emerges as a European-wide belief that Europeans were the best race on Earth. How could they prove this? Eventually, they took an idea from Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species, which was published in 1859, in which Darwin introduces the concept of natural selection. While that text caused, and continues to cause, all sorts of tension, another English biologist and philosopher, a man by the name of Herbert Spencer, conflates Darwin's biological idea of evolution into one that encompasses all of human activity, including the creation of societies. Spencer coins the phrase survival of the fittest. That's not Darwin's phrase, that's Spencer's phrase. And what Spencer means by that is that he takes Darwin's concept of natural selection and he says, you know what? Not only does natural selection work with the species, it also works with societies. The survival of the best society indicates that it is the best society. And because it's the best society, it should rule over all. By this logic, since Europeans were clearly the fittest race on Earth, it was in fact only fitting that they would expand to encompass the entirety of the Earth and to educate non-Europeans in the European way. This is the logic that comes to be known as social Darwinism. Now, since Americans were descended from Europeans, they jump on to this bandwagon as well. This idea takes really strong hold in Europe, and it comes to be seen as a moral responsibility which is in fact known as the white man's burden. In fact, Rudyard Kipling, who is a very well-known author of the late 19th century, even writes a poem about it. I'm going to read you here a little excerpt. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. I like that excerpt because I think it describes this particular cartoon really, really well in its stereotypes and in its moral responsibility. Now, this age of exploration, new age of exploration, is called the Age of Imperialism, as opposed to the Age of Colonialism, which takes place earlier in the 15th and 16th centuries. This new imperialism was different from earlier colonialism in that it was an expansion of territory which sought more direct exploitation of all aspects of the colony, not just its government, but also its trade, also its laborers, etc. Europeans sought direct government rule. European officials in charge, European-style governments. This is as opposed to indirect rule in which they left or allowed natives to run systems of government and they just took a tax or a tribute in payment, which is what had happened a lot of times during the age of colonialism. Europeans built and they maintained European-style infrastructure in their territories so as to better exploit these territories. For example, in Egypt in the 1860s, a consortium of French, British, and German investors built the Suez Canal, which cut a path between the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. So now, instead of sailing all around Africa to get to their colonies in South or Southeast Asia, British and French ships could just sail across the Mediterranean, across the Suez Canal, across the Red Sea, and over just the northern part of the Indian Ocean to South and Southeast Asia. In a very similar way, in Panama, in the early 20th century, the United States built the Panama Canal, which connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This is a canal that will be controlled by the United States until the year 1999. It allowed the U.S. to ship goods from one coast to another, in addition to very, very quickly get to colonial properties in the Pacific, and then, of course, during times of war, to get navies and armies from one ocean to another. It was really indispensable during both world wars. There were various responses of native peoples to imperialism, and if we focus just a little bit on this image, you can maybe see why these reactions are here. These images are from a book called An ABC for Baby Patriots. It was a reader, a primer, for children learning to read. So here for the letter E. E is our empire, where sun never sets. The larger we make it, the bigger it gets. Well, they were making it larger at the expense of native peoples who were seeing their ownership of their land and even their ownership of their labor kind of falling to the Europeans. So they had various responses to this. Some areas, which were conquered during the Age of Imperialism, had been completely independent until the 1880s. And usually the responses of those native peoples was armed aggression, mostly through guerrilla warfare. They're going to try to evict the Europeans from their territory. They're not going to be really successful most of the time because Europeans have better weapons. And so even if the Europeans didn't have bigger numbers, at least initially, they did have better weapons, and the better weapons won. So Europeans took over large portions of Africa. Remember that many of the regions affected by the Age of Imperialism, though, had already been conquered and colonized by Europe. This was true of lots of areas in Asia as well as areas in coastal Africa. So in these older colonies where Europeans are returning and now exploiting the land more directly, responses tended to fluctuate between reactionary movements and modernizing movements. Reactionaries attempted to preserve native culture at all costs, and sometimes they were doing this by engaging in terrorist activity against the Europeans or against European sympathizers. But native modernizers believed that there was a compromise between native culture and specifically the education that came from the European system. They believed it was possible to use European know-how to benefit the native people. So in some cases, modernizers worked with the colonial powers, mostly to try to benefit the native people. So how precisely might that work? Well, hopefully some of this is now familiar to you. Remember that Britain's first contacts with India happened in the late 17th century between the British East India Tea Company, right, the EIC, and the Indian Mughal government. So as to maximize their trading profit, the EIC took control of larger and larger parts of India, and then they hired Indians to be soldiers for the EIC, right? They called these soldiers sepoys. Well, over the course of the 18th and early 19th century, Mughal power diminished, while that of the EIC increased. The EIC had wealth, they offered jobs, they offered security, and so native peoples were very attracted to this. It was a very similar story in the 17th century with the Dutch East India Company, which is known as the VOC, in the area they controlled, which was Indonesia, right, the Spice Islands. Same sort of thing. The Dutch came in, they hired natives as soldiers, they trained them, and it's a very attractive system. It's stable, it's secure. Well, not all areas of Asia had such a great relationship with the British, and a case in point, of course, is China. In the late 18th century, the British come to realize that opium is a pretty valuable cash crop. It's made from the poppy flower, it can be harvested and sold worldwide, and it starts to contribute to a problem of addiction, which is going to plague Britain and also the United States and other Western areas throughout the 19th century and even into the 20th century. Now, at first, the British are growing opium in northern India and modern-day Pakistan. They really quick realized that just right across the border in China, you also have some prime opium growing land. Well, the British had sold opium in India, and they realized that the Chinese also would like to purchase opium. The problem is, the Chinese used opium medicinally, and it was really heavily regulated by the Chinese government. They grew only enough opium for medicinal purposes, and the Chinese government really resented the British attempt to sell opium to Chinese people. However, the British kept smuggling opium over the border between British India and China, as well as paying Chinese farmers to grow opium so that the British could sell it abroad. This contributes to a growing problem of addiction in China, and it undermines the position of the Chinese government because now there's this segment of their regulation that's pretty much out of their control. So there are wars. These are Anglo-Chinese wars between 1839 and 1860, really, a series of these opium wars. Whoever's got the biggest, best weapons wins. And eventually Britain wins the war. As a result of this wrangling between the British and the Chinese government starts to become very weak in the middle of the 19th century and continues to weaken until we get to the beginning of the 20th century. The Chinese are going to be forced to open up and allow lots of European governments all sorts of incentives to trade in and with the Chinese. But by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, we also start to see these native peoples react against the Europeans and try to establish their own voice in government. And so we have, as you guys well know and should remember from the first 6 weeks, the outbreak of the Sepoy Rebellion, or the First War for Independence, in 1857. The rumor flies, as you will recall, that the British are trying to trick sepoys, that the new gun cartridges are greased in cow fat, not pork fat. That's a problem, either way, because to Hindus, the cow is sacred. Well, to Muslims, they shouldn't eat pork. The British are unaware, really don't understand, why the sepoys refuse to employ these cartridges. The sepoys rebel, the British fight back. The consequence of the Sepoy Rebellion is not just that the Indians are again oppressed by the Europeans, but that the EIC has to transfer power to the British government because they realize they can't really control it anymore. So in 1876, Queen Victoria is crowned the Empress of India. And then to protect their lucrative colony, the British establish buffer colonies. They establish a colony on Singapore, they establish a colony on Burma, both of which serve to protect the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, which is considered to be India. Well, the French, not to be outdone, are also looking to expand their empire. Well, France had sent Catholic missionaries to Vietnam in the early 1800s, and these missionaries built churches and schools, and they began to educate the population. By the 1840s, local Vietnamese authorities had begun persecuting missionaries because as Christianity and specifically Catholicism spread throughout Vietnam, part of that story is this realization that people are important, that they have rights, at least in a spiritual sense, and they started to revolt again against their leaders, their Vietnamese leaders, and the Vietnamese leaders understandably didn't like this. So missionaries are being persecuted, but at the same time, there are some Vietnamese scholars who push for reforms. Vietnam had been isolationist, they'd been stagnant for over 100 years, and these scholars who were educated not just in the Vietnamese system, but also in the French system, saw the benefits of compromise. In response to the violence against these French citizens, right, on the part of the Vietnamese, France moved to make Vietnam a protectorate of the French Empire in 1859, and after fighting a war against the Vietnamese, the French managed to occupy the city of Saigon in 1861, and they established Vietnam as a colony of the French Empire. Vietnam's value to France came in the form of an important cash crop, which is rice. By 1900, the French had spread across Southeast Asia, and in 1900, they established a new colony, the Union of French Indochina, which includes the modern-day countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. So like Britain, they're looking to expand their possibilities in industrialization, but in exploitation of the land as well. So this is the story that we see over and over again when it comes to imperialism. Which leads us kind of inevitably to the concept of buffer zones. There were some areas in Asia that become buffer zones between the European powers because they are trying to maintain this balance of power, because that's important for European politics. But how do you do that when all of these great powers also want to expand their colonies? What emerges, particularly between Great Britain and Russia, is what's known as the Great Game. Now, while Britain maintains control of the Indian subcontinent, which includes what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh, Russia wanted part of that area as well, and they worried that if Britain controlled all of that territory, they were going to want to push northward into what Russia controlled as part of their territory. Now, both Russia and Britain get involved in Afghan politics and eventually agree to maintain Afghanistan as a buffer zone between Russian and British areas of Central Asia. And that's really what this cartoon down here illustrates. The same tension between these two great powers also existed with regards to Persia. Once home to the great Safavid Empire, Persia, by the time we get to the 1800s, is basically a really weak kingdom, and it's surrounded by dying empires like the Ottoman Empire to its west, or colonies like India and Pakistan to its east. The possibility that Persia could be beneficial as a colony was attractive both to Great Britain and to Russia. But at the same time, they didn't want to go to war over this territory. So Persia goes back and forth as a buffer zone. And that, of course, is what this cartoon is about. You have the British lion, you have the Russian bear, and the Persian cat. At times during the 1800s, Russia was a bit more in control of this area than Britain was. And Britain, as the cartoon intimates, wasn't too happy about that situation. In addition to this, in Southeast Asia, both Britain and France are going to agree to maintain the Kingdom of Siam, modern-day Thailand, as a buffer zone between different areas. So this concept of buffer zones was really important because it was helping to maintain the balance of power in Europe. But if we look back at China, we can see why these quote-unquote buffer zones were concerned for their future. China was greatly weakened by the Opium Wars and by this injection of foreign power. A civil war emerges in the middle of the 19th century in China. This is known as the Taiping Rebellion. It was really similar in intent to the French Revolution in that the lower classes wanted greater power, but it was also caused by ethnic tensions and the encroachment of foreigners, such as the British in Chinese affairs, in that the lower classes resented that these foreigners are coming in and trying to tell the Chinese government what to do. In addition to that, the rebels, who are known as the Taipings, also used Protestant Christianity as one of their philosophies. So it's odd that they're fighting against foreign influence, and yet they're using a foreign influence as part of their goal and their methodology. Their message was messianic. They believed that the Taiping founder was a younger brother of Jesus, and so he deserved the right to rule over the Chinese people. While the Taiping Rebellion shows how weak the government is, it leads to greater economic instability, thanks in part to the government's overextension. And effectively, what happens is that the Taiping Rebellion forces China to decentralize, and parts of China fall to various regional warlords, as well as to foreign powers. So if we look at this map here, you can see that Mongolia falls to Russia, essentially. This area right here along the Pacific also falls to Russia. Japan will take over Korea. And then you have all these little rebellions, including other foreign rebellions, like a Muslim rebellion here in Western China, that lead to this decentralization. There's another rebellion at the tail end of the century. This is the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. The Boxer Rebellion is called that because the rebels were part of the Society of Harmonious Fists, or Righteous Fists. They were a secret society that blamed China's troubles, particularly its weak political system and its weak economic system, on foreigners. The Empress Dowager, at the time, Cixi, believed that the Boxers might defeat the foreigners, and so she secretly encouraged them. She trusted that the Boxers would defeat the foreigners, and then she'd be able to come back and establish her control over China. Well, the Boxers laid siege to part of Beijing, but they were in turn defeated by a coalition of 12 nations, basically European nations, and Japan. In the peace negotiations that followed, China had to accept severe penalties that further undermined China's political and economic systems. Well, the aftermath is eventually going to lead to the adoption of a constitutional monarchy after the death of the empress. And then eventually, in the early part of the 20th century, China will become a republic. But as a reward for their help against the Boxers, the Chinese are going to be forced to adopt an open door policy. Officially, this was just kind of an agreement that European countries and the United States could trade freely with China. In actuality, though, what it meant was that China had to offer some countries, like Britain, Russia, Germany, and the United States, favorable trading status within China's borders. And then these countries are going to use their special status to influence Chinese political and economic policies as well. If we look at this political cartoon, you kind of see that happening. You have the Chinese man Stereotypical Manchurian. No, no, stop. But you have here Queen Victoria representing the British. Yes. If we look here more closely at the helmet, this is going to be Germany. We have here the French, also can be interpreted as the United States. We have here the Russians, and here the Japanese, all of them dividing up this pizza pie, which is China. So why were these areas just so attractive to European imperialists? Well, if you forgive the blurriness of this map, just look at the resources that are available. And these are primarily metal resources, mineral resources, which were newly important in the Industrial Revolution. It was no longer enough to be able to get furs from the Americas or timber from the Americas. You needed metals. You needed the ability to create the steel, to create the railroads, to create the railways, to bring an empire together. So these new resources become hugely important, and as they are discovered in parts of the colonies, both new and old, that really increases the interest of the Europeans. So they're now newly interested in China, in India. Japan, of course, is independent and is able to take advantage of it themselves. Indonesia for the Dutch, Australia for the British. The same is true in Africa. But Africa's a little bit different in that Africa didn't seem to have a lot of the same mineral resources. But what Africa did have was lots of land, some of which was fertile, and lots of people who could be exploited. And that's what we're going to look at next, the exploitation of Africa during the Age of Imperialism.